In today's top story, we're reminded White Ruth is often stranger than fiction. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, or even 5 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a beer, and then give them an ODULS. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's stories. In the spring of 2013, a young woman named Melissa finally moved out of her mother's house and got her own place across town. For the first few months she was living there, she never noticed anything strange. But about 3 months into living there, things started to get a little bit weird. It started with a whole bunch of hang-up calls where someone from different numbers would call. She'd answer and she could hear them breathing, but they weren't saying anything. And then she started getting these huge bouquets of flowers delivered to her front step, but they were delivered from anonymous. Then, after that, she started noticing things in her kitchen and her living room were going missing. Things like plates, cups, drink coasters, salt shakers, forks, and knives, little things. But since she lived alone, and she was the only one moving these things, it really stood out. Melissa had this habit that every time she went to bed, she would unplug her TV. She had this irrational fear she didn't do that it would spark a fire and her house would burn down in the middle of the night. So, she was pretty obsessive-compulsive about always making sure the TV was unplugged before she went upstairs to bed. And so one night, around the same time she's getting these hang-up calls, and there's flowers being sent to her and things are going missing, she unplugged her EV and she goes up to bed. The next morning, she gets up and comes downstairs, and the TV's plugged in again. She convinces herself that, well, she must have forgot to unplug the TV. As rare of an event as that is, it has to be what happened. And so, that night, she unplugged the TV and remembers looking directly at the plug, confirming that, yes, I've unplugged the TV. Then she puts it down and looks again at the outlet. It's not plugged in. It's definitely not plugged in. And then she goes upstairs to bed. The next morning, when she walks downstairs, she had the sense of dread that when she turned the corner, because her TV was right at the bottom of the stairs, that when she turned the corner, it would be plugged in again and her worst nightmare would come true, that something is happening on my first floor when I'm asleep at night. And as she comes down the stairs and turns the corner, what does she see? The TV is plugged in again. She's horrified, but has no idea what to do. It's not some malicious act, and she's telling herself, well, maybe I forgot again. But then she's like, no, I remember last night staring at the plug. I definitely unplugged it. And so she flies around her first floor to make sure, 1, everything is locked, but 2, no one else is in here. And when she's satisfied that, yep, it's empty down here, and 2, everything is locked, she sits there thinking, well, now what do? Do I call the police and say someone's plugging in my TV? You know, she can't do anything. And it was at this point that Melissa developed a fear of her first floor, and she began going to bed so early at night because she could not be on that floor when it started to get dark. So imagine living alone, being afraid of going down to your first floor. How scary it would be at night when you're laying in bed, your door's shut, and any noise you hear in the house, you're gonna rebuke to your first floor. And so Melissa was living this absolutely wretched life where she's scared of everything outside of her bedroom. And so with that as context, Melissa goes to bed one night super early, probably like 3. How's your road? The sun's not even down yet, but she's upstairs. But eventually it does get dark outside, and she still has not fallen asleep. And so she sits up in bed and she turns on the TV, and right away the channels on the screen start to change. And she's thinking, oh, I must be laying on the remote, but then she remembers the remote's in my hand. And so she's looking at the remote, and then she's looking at the TV. She's not touching her remote, and the channels are still cycling. Now Melissa had what's called a skybox, which means her downstairs TV was connected to her upstairs TV and vice versa. If one was changing the channel in real time, the other changed the channel in real time. And so as she's looking at her remote and not touching it, and looking at the screen as the channels are changing, it dawns on her that someone downstairs is changing the channels. And so, frozen in fear, all she can think to do is turn off her TV, because that's the one function that does not have any impact on the other TV. So she turns the TV off. And so, in total darkness in a house she's already terrified of, she is straining her ears to try to hear some sign that this is either someone's down there flipping through channels, or this is nothing and I just happened to turn the TV on when the skybox was malfunctioning. And as she's sitting there, all she can hear is her own breathing, and she can feel the pounding of her heart in her chest. But she doesn't hear any sounds in her house. She doesn't hear the TV on, she doesn't hear footsteps, doors opening. But none of that. It's silence in the house. So after what probably felt like an eternity, she just grabbed a pillow and clutched it in front of her and put her head into the pillow and just lay like that until she eventually fell asleep. The next morning, when she gets up, the sun is out and it's this huge relief because suddenly, with the sunlight pouring in the windows, it was like the house wasn't scary anymore. And she's telling herself, you know what's elf? That had to have been just some anomaly with the skybox. I bet I go downstairs and the TV's unplugged. And so she goes downstairs and the TV is unplugged. And so that for her kind of confirms that, okay, the paranoia is getting to me. I'm losing my mind a little bit. I gotta tell someone what's going on. And so as it happens that day, she was going to a family birthday party. And so when she gets there, she pulls her older brother aside and says, here's the strange things that are happening in my house with the skybox and all this. And at first, he looked at her like, really? This is what's going on. You're seeing ghosts in your house. But when she really focused on the specific things that were happening, like the plug going back into the wall to separate times, and then the skybox thing, so the TV is kind of wrapped up in the weirdness that's been happening in her house and the missing items in her house. And so for the brother, it all kind of added up to, okay, this does seem a little bit weird. And he offered to live with her for a few days and just see it for himself. And as they're talking, their younger brother happens to walk by, overhears the conversation, and says, oh, I'll stay there too. For 4 days, the two brothers lived on the first floor of Melissa's house, and they don't see anything. They don't hear anything. It's completely ordinary. And Melissa at first was reassured, but then started to think, does that mean whoever's been doing this stuff is watching my house really closely and knows that I have, protection at my house right now and they're staying away? Does that mean I'm being watched really closely? And so finally, when her brothers are getting ready to leave after the 4th day, she was practically begging them to stay. She couldn't stand the idea of staying in this house. Her brothers reassured her that she had nothing to worry about, but if she experienced anything weird anytime, any day, just call or text and they would be there in a heartbeat. Although she did not feel reassured, it was starting to get late, at least by her standards. It was like 3:00, so the sun's getting close to going down, so she needs to go upstairs. So she goes back in her house and does like 20 trips around her house to confirm everything is shut, everything is locked, no one's in the house, everything is safe. And then she goes upstairs to bed. But like most nights, she was so scared of everything outside of her bedroom door that she couldn't sleep. And as she's laying there in utter silence in her room, she hears the unmistakable sound of her back door opening. And she hears footsteps walking through her first floor. And then she hears the TV turn on. And her brothers have been watching her TV last, and they had the volume set really, really high. So as soon as the TV went on, it blared all through the house. And immediately, the TV turned back off because whoever turned it on knew that that was going to wake up whoever was in the house. Melissa doesn't know what to do. Before, whatever the heck was happening in her house was a little bit subtle. It was like she had to think about what she was hearing to confirm it was actually happening. Now, this person is just strolling into her house in the middle of the night and flipping on the TV and blaring it through the house. And so she immediately is like, oh my God, what do? I do. And she picks up her phone and she calls her brother, and he picks up right away. And she goes, someone is in the house right now. The brother's like, I will be there in 10 minutes. Do not leave your bedroom. Don't do anything. Stay on the phone with me. So Melissa's shaking out of fear, and she gets up as slowly as she can and she walks over to the window to get as far away from the door, which was locked, as she possibly could. And she's glancing out the window, waiting to see her brother pull up, as she listens for any sign that this person downstairs has begun walking upstairs. Finally, Melissa sees out of the corner of her brother's car pulls up across the street, and he, along with her younger brother, hop out. They run across the street towards her house. They hop over the fence and they run down the alley between her house and her neighbors, and they go towards the back out of sight. She's still on the phone with him, and she's saying, do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? And he says, hold on. He goes to the back of the house where he knows you can look in and basically see the whole first floor. And as soon as he gets to that spot where she's expecting him to give her a report, he pauses. There's silence on the phone. And she goes, what do you see? And he says, okay, yep, there is someone in your living room right now. I'm gonna hang up and call the police, and I'm gonna call you right back. Now, Melissa knew what she heard was very real to her, but to have it confirmed by her brother right now took this to a whole another level of fear. Now she's legitimately fearing for her life. There is a person, an intruder, in my house right now. Confirmed. They are right downstairs, and they've been coming into my house probably for weeks. And so her brother hangs up the phone and begins calling the police. Meanwhile, Melissa is just standing in this room, horrified, as she listens to a stranger walk around the first floor of her house. But because she was hearing the footsteps clearly downstairs, she decided she would just walk over to her door and look through the keyhole, which was oversized on her door. And if you look through it and over to the left, you'd actually look downstairs to the first floor. You'd only see a sliver of the first floor. And so, very carefully, she walks her way over to the door. And as she kneels down to look through the keyhole, her phone rings. It was in her pocket, and it wasn't on silent, it was on loud. And it was her brother calling back. And she kind of fumbles for her phone, she drops it on the ground, it's still ringing, and she finally silences it. And then reflexively, she pokes her head back and looks through the keyhole. And standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at her, is a man with a hat pulled over his eyes who's clearly heard the sound. And he begins walking up the stairs. She's falling over backwards, screaming at the top of her lungs to get her brothers inside. She hears them come charging inside. She hears this epic struggle on the stairs. And she hears this person who's in her house, cause it was a voice she didn't recognize, screaming, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And then it's quiet. And so she opens that door because she wants to help if she can. And she looks, and she sees her brothers have this man pinned on the stairs. He's not moving. And she sees her younger brother is holding something, and he holds it up to her and he just shakes his head. And it's a freaking knife. And then she puts it together that the stranger in her house was carrying this knife. And before she can even take that information in, the older brother takes the hat off of this guy. Oh. And it's their mother's ex-boyfriend from 10 years ago. The same one they all believed had an inappropriate attraction to Melissa. Police show up and take him away, and he quickly admitted to sneaking into her house for months. They don't know how he got in, and he would never tell them, but he admitted that, yep, I was breaking in almost every single night. But he never gave a good reason why. He just started doing it. Police cited mental illness as the likely culprit for why he was doing it, and the family believed this could be something more sinister. But either way, he was given 3 years in jail, and the family once again cut all ties with him. In February of 2013, a young woman named Kim finally moved out of her parents' house, and she moved into this tiny little apartment that she absolutely loved. Kim had severe social anxiety. She could not stand being out in public, talking to people she didn't know, and so she would do everything in her power to stay indoors. She had a job that didn't require her to travel, and so having this little apartment was like her little oasis. When she was there, she was safe. If she had to leave, she was practically running to her car and running back so she didn't have to talk to anybody. In those first few weeks she was living there, as much as she tried to avoid all contact with other people, there was one person she was kind of forced to have an interaction with, and that was her landlord. But her landlord turned out to be this awesome old woman named Olivia, who really took a liking to Kim and kind of looked at Kim as like her daughter. And Kim was surprised at herself for wanting to interact with Olivia. She was very comforting, and she was this really nice lady. And so, even though they didn't actually interact that much, they developed this relationship where Olivia liked to make food. And she'd come over to Kim's door and she'd knock, and she'd leave it outside of her door. And she didn't expect Kim to come out and talk to her. She knew Kim was uncomfortable being out in public, and so she didn't push her to do that. Instead, she just expected her to eat some nice food, and whenever Kim was done eating, to put her dishes back outside the door, and Olivia would take it up and she would go clean it. And that was that. And so Kim really grew to love Olivia and was very happy to have her there. It was like she made her feel safe. 2 months after moving into this tiny little new apartment, Kim started taking a new medication for her anxiety. Now, historically, she had taken a whole bunch of different medications and knew when you start a new one. It's not uncommon to have a whole bunch of side effects that you're just not used to, and they're kind of awful and you need some time to get used to them. So at the same time she's taking this new medication, she starts to notice that she's forgetting things. Things in her apartment are being put in places she does not remember putting them, and things are going missing, and she can't remember where she put them. And so, even though she was expecting side effects from this new drug, she was really frustrated with the memory loss. She also noticed this medication made her exceptionally drowsy, to the point where most days she had to take a nap for 2 or 3 hours in the middle of the day just to get through the day. Because Kim had such intense anxiety about being out in public, she did not want to go to the doctors to get a different prescription or to even talk to the doctor about, is this normal? Because that doctor's visit would necessitate a whole bunch of interactions with people she doesn't want to interact with. And so she decided, you know what, I'm just going to take my medication. I'm going to let myself adjust to this new normal, and everything will be just fine. During the time period that she's experiencing all these side effects that she is attributing to her new medication, she got a delivery from Olivia. It was a Greek salad that she knew Kim loved. Kim's psyched about this Greek salad. She brings it in her apartment and she decides, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna have a nice day to myself. I'm gonna go in my bedroom. I'm gonna turn on Netflix. And I'm gonna eat this salad in bed. It's gonna be awesome. So, she's sitting in bed. She's eating her salad. She's watching Portland, IA. And then she falls asleep right in the middle. Like, as she's eating her salad, she's falling asleep. She's so tired. When she woke up, she's like, wow, I'd never fallen asleep that hard and that fast before. And she's literally still got the fork in her hand from eating her salad. And then she notices on the other side of the bed, the left side of the bed, the sheets are all disturbed, like someone has been laying there. And Kim always sleeps on the right side of the bed. It was almost like a compulsion for Kim that she could never sleep on the left side, like it was bad luck. And she reaches her hand out and she feels that side of the bed where it's been disturbed. And it's still warm. And so she quickly thinks to herself, well, I guess I must have rolled over and laid on that side of the bed and then rolled back to this side. Just miraculously right back in the same position I was in with the salad fork still in hand. And that's when it kind of clicks in her head like, that's not possible. That's not possible. So what does that mean? Does that mean someone's in my apartment right now? And so she leaps out of bed, she gets her phone, she enters 911, and she's ready to dial it. And she flips on all the lights in her apartment, she's running around, and there's no one in her apartment. The apartment's still locked. Everything is normal. And so she puts her phone away and her heart's still racing. She's very stressed out about what's just occurred because in her mind, in the back of her mind, anyways, she knows she didn't roll over. That didn't happen. This is when Kim began to wonder, are all these strange happenings in my apartment connected to what just happened now? Because this incident right here does not feel medication side effect driven. And so all of a sudden, she's looking at the other weird things in her apartment, like the missing toothbrush and the missing shoes and things getting moved around as suddenly connected. And it dawns on her that maybe she's been blind to something else happening. Maybe someone is breaking into my apartment. So for the next couple of days, Kim watched her apartment like a hawk to see if there was any indication of somebody breaking into her apartment at any point. And there was nothing. She always locked the door. She always kept the windows shut. The only thing that stood out to her was when she woke up in the mornings, her bedroom had a very distinctive smell to it. It wasn't her smell, and it wasn't a smell she was used to. It was like another person's smell, and it really freaked her out. She decided it's time to tell my parents. And so, when she tells her parents and she's describing out loud what's been going on in her apartment, it's the first time she's hearing herself say this stuff out loud, and it sounds way more creepy and way more scary than it did in her own head. And so as she's telling them, she's becoming scared to go back to her apartment. And her dad picks up on that and says, "Hey, I'll go back with you. Look around your apartment and we'll make sure it's safe and secure. And then on the way out, we'll check in with your landlady and we'll let her know what's going on. So she's brought in and everything's gonna be fine." They go back to her apartment. They go inside and when they walk in, everything looks normal. They kind of do a walkthrough. The apartment looks normal. But before her dad leaves, he says, "Hey, let me just do a closer inspection of your whole apartment. Let me look everywhere and make sure there's not like some special way to get in here, just to give you peace of mind." And so he went into her bedroom and he starts looking around, and he's lifting up the mattress and looking underneath. And then he opens up her closet, which is this big closet, lots of clothes in there. It's not quite a walk-in closet, but it's big enough that you can easily stand in there. And her father reaches in and splits the clothes, and he uses his light to look at all of the back wall. And he pushes on it and he taps on it, and he sees that there's any sort of special compartment. There's not. But before he walks out again, he notices a little blurb of writing on the bottom right corner of the inner wall, an area that you could only see if you were standing in the closet looking for strange things on the wall of the inside of this closet. He kneels down to take a look at it, and it's this little tiny blurb of text that says, "Come back here so I can look at you." And the only way you could write it is if you were laying down in this tiny little corner facing the exit of the closet. And that's when her father looks at the bottom of the closet, and one of the slats on the closet door was missing. And so, in theory, if you were someone that was writing this message, you'd be laying down where your eyes would be looking through that slat right at her bed. Her father put it together and he stood up. He walked out to his daughter and he said, "Come over here." He showed her what's in her closet and he said, "Did you write that?" And she goes, "No's." And he goes, "All right, it's time to leave." They walk outside, they go to his truck and he calls the police and he says, "Someone's breaking into my daughter's apartment." Police show up and, using CCTV footage, they capture a grown man regularly going into Kim's apartment in the middle of the night, and he clearly has a key. It would turn out to be Olivia's grown adult son named Henry, who lived with her, who apparently, as soon as he saw Kim for the first time, he fell madly in love with her and became very obsessed with her. And he developed this fake relationship in his mind where he believed he and Kim were dating, even though Kim didn't even know Henry existed. She didn't even know he was living with Olivia. She had never seen him before. During questioning, Henry said what he did is he got sleeping pills and he ground them up. And anytime his mother was delivering food to Kim, which she loved to do and she was always excited about it, so she was talking about it, so he would know what was happening. He would put sleeping pills in her food. He would mix it in, and then he knew as soon as it was delivered, she would be asleep. And he would use his mother's spare key to go into the apartment. And what he said he did is he never touched her. He never laid a hand on Kim. Instead, he laid next to her in bed or watched her from inside the closet. So for the 4 months that Kim lived in this apartment, where she believed every time she came inside and shut the doors that she was kind of away from society, she could just be alone in her bubble. Well, in reality, there was some psychopath just a few feet away from her almost the entire time. When Olivia found out about all of this, she made a point to tell Kim she had nothing to do with it and she was terribly sorry. But their friendship ended. On October 17th, 1941, 73-year-old Philip Peters was supposed to join his friends for dinner, but he never showed up. His neighbors knew Phil was living alone at the time because his wife had recently fallen and broken her hip and was in the hospital. So they were worried about Phil being on his own, and they thought, you know what? Let's just be sure. Let's call the police and have them go over and check on him. When the police arrived at his house, they knocked on the door. No answer. They tried the door handle. It was locked. They tried the other door. That was locked too. They looked in the windows. It was all dark, and they had to get another neighbor who had a key to open the door for them. When they stepped inside, there was blood everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, everywhere. And in the middle of the kitchen is Phil Peters, face down. He has been bludgeoned to death. Police immediately draw their weapons and they're looking around the house, thinking someone could still be here. And they clear the whole house, and there's no one there. And so a whole bunch of detectives converge on the house and they start investigating. And they realize pretty quickly how strange the scene was about to be murder. Nothing in the house was vandalized. Nothing in the house was stolen. And Phil himself was just a very modest retired auditor. He certainly didn't have any enemies. And so the revenge angle didn't necessarily make much sense. But then you gotta remember that when police first got there, before they discovered his body, the house was shut and locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. And so whoever was in there with Phil at the time of his death must have known Phil enough to have a key of their own, or have Phil open the door for them. So it made investigators wonder what would motivate some person that's in Phil's inner circle to commit such a heinous crime, when the obvious angles such as theft, vandalism, revenge have basically been crossed off. Not to mention, there was virtually no evidence of who could have done this, with the exception of the murder weapon, which was this big piece of metal called a stove shaker. But the person who had used it to kill him had taken the time to meticulously wipe it off. There was nothing on it. No fingerprints, no anything. So for months, detectives agonized over this case, but they got nowhere. 9 months later, a housekeeper was hired by Phil's widow to help around the house now that Phil was gone. And she said as soon as she moved in, she started hearing strange tapping sounds all through the house, but didn't think anything of it. And so that day, the day she's calling police, she's alone in the Peters residence and she hears the tapping, and it's coming from a kitchen. And she thinks, oh, it's gotta be a woodpecker just outside the house, outside the window. And she said as she looked into the kitchen, on the other side of the kitchen was a door that opened up to a flight of stairs that went to the second floor. And she said it was slowly opening, and out from behind comes this white hand that reaches to the side of the door and begins to pull it open. And she screams, and the hand retracts back into the space. And then she hears it's torn up the stairs and run around on the upstairs before going silent again. She ran out of the house, and she ran to a neighbor's house to call the police. The police immediately go to the house and they go inside, guns drawn, and they're looking for this person because they're thinking perhaps the murderer is back. And they're looking all through the house and there's nothing. There's not even a sign of a break-in. And so, the police go back to the housekeeper and to Mrs. Peters. They explain that we couldn't find anyone, but given the history of your house, we don't think it's safe for you to be in there. And so the housekeeper didn't go back, and Mrs. Peters was moved back to the hospital where she could be looked after during the police investigation. At this point, the police decide we're going to permanently stake out this house. We're going to have two detectives that are outside this house, watching it at all times. And so two detectives go and they're sitting outside, and for a couple of days they're not seeing anything. They're not hearing anything. And they decide to just go inside and have a look around. They both walk into the house, they go upstairs, they look around. They don't see anything. They go back downstairs, and as they're standing on the first floor getting ready to leave, they hear what sounds like a doorknob turning upstairs. They both heard it, so they go upstairs and they start searching different rooms. And one of the detectives goes into the bedroom and opens up a closet. And past all the clothes, bottom left-hand corner, he sees a foot dart into a little space in the back corner of the closet. And without any hesitation, this guy jumps head first into the closet and grabs the foot of this mystery person who's crawling into a tiny little panel in the back of a closet. And he holds on to this person who's fighting with their life to get away, and he starts pulling them out. And he's yelling for his partner to come over. He comes charging in. They both grab this person and they yank this person out, and they would describe him as the strangest looking person they had ever seen. He was super tall but rail thin, and his skin was so dirty it appeared gray. His name was Theodore Conias, and he had been living in this house for a year. Before Conias moved in, he had fallen on hard times. He was sleeping in alleyways. And as it started to get colder in September of 1941, he decided he would approach his longtime friend, Phil Peters, and he would ask him for some money and maybe an opportunity to crash at his house for a couple of days. But as it happened, when he got to Phil's house, Phil wasn't there. Phil was at the hospital visiting his wife who had a broken hip, and so the house was vacant. And Conias saw an opportunity, and he broke in. And at first, his plan was just to steal food, get warmed up a little bit, and then leave. But he noticed when he was looking through the house for things to take, that in the back of one of these closets was a panel that led to this tiny little, almost secret attic space that wasn't being used for anything because it was impossibly small. You'd have to be incredibly skinny just to get through the little square opening that would bring you into this little space. And then once you got in, you could only get in by slithering head first in. You couldn't stand up. You had to be laying the entire time. You couldn't extend your legs all the way if you're a full-grown adult, so you're kind of tucked up in almost like a pseudo-fetal position. But Conias saw this as a huge upgrade from living on the streets, and he decided that this is where he's going to live for the winter. And so he went around the house gathering supplies between blankets and food and water, and he filled his tiny little space. And then he went back downstairs and he locked the front door again, made sure everything looked the way it was when he showed up, and he went into his little space and shut the door behind him. And when Phil came home that night, he didn't notice anything. And for the next several weeks, Phil never noticed a thing. Every time Phil would leave, Conias would sneak out, go downstairs, make himself some coffee, get a bite to eat, and go back up to his little space. He even cut into the house's wiring system and stole one of Phil's radios, brought it into the cubby with him, attached it to the new wiring, and he got to listen to the news so he didn't feel so isolated from the outside world. But about a month later, Conias leaves his little spot to go downstairs cause he thinks Phil is gone. He gets to the kitchen, he's going to the fridge. When he shuts the fridge, he looks over and there's Phil standing there looking at him like, "What are you doing in my kitchen?" In a panic, Conias grabs the stove shaker and beats Phil to death. Not knowing what else to do, he wipes off the murder weapon, leaves it where it is, goes in the fridge, he gets more food and drink, and he goes right back up to where he lives. He would follow the investigation of Phil Peters' death on his radio, curled up inside of Phil Peters' house. Conias was quickly found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. After hearing his sentence read to him, he says out loud, "Now I feel safe. I'll have a better home than I've had in years." So, that's gonna do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's stories, and if you found today's secret, please let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. First one to do that will get pinned. If you enjoyed the video today and you haven't done this already, please offer the like button a beer, but then give them an ODULS. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same, it's just John Ballen for 116. I also have a ton of content over on TIKDOK, where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So, whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, read it, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's gonna do it. See ya. I will be shocked if any of you can figure out what actually happened before I reveal it at the end of the show. But before I get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do. And we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, then the next time the like button approaches you and says, hey, where's a good place to lay out and get a good suntan? Suggest the faraway dock on Kidney Mountain. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's story. On September 15th, 2010, a 55-year-old man named Greg F.L.E. Nikian checked into the elegant hotel in Beaumont, Texas, to start his work week. As a young man, Greg had worked as a chief engineer on ocean-going vessels, spending months out at sea, but in his middle age, he had reinvented himself as a landman. It was Greg's job to secure leases of mineral rights and land for drilling. Greg was slender and fit-looking, despite the fact that he never exercised and he smoked constantly. He kept a close-cropped white beard, and he had the leather-edged skin of a lifelong outdoorsman. Every Monday morning, Greg would make the 2-hour commute in his pickup truck from Lafayette, Louisiana, all the way to Beaumont, Texas, where his company would always rent him a room. The hotel itself was neither good nor bad, but to Greg, he didn't care. He just needed a bed and a TV. Once Greg walked inside, he had a bathroom immediately to his right, and then a little bit farther in was the main section of the hotel room, which was very basic. Straight ahead there was a window that looked down onto a small pool that was lined with potted plants. And then in the main space was a queen-size bed tucked up against the right wall. And then on the left wall was a TV. Greg wheeled his one suitcase into the hotel room and he put it at the foot of the bed and he opened it up. He pulled out the shirts that he wanted to keep wrinkle-free for the weekend. He hung them in his closet. Then he pulled out his toiletries that were kept in a cloth bag with a hook and he hooked those onto a towel rack. Then he took off his very worn brown boots and his faded blue jeans, and he slipped on some pajama pants. Anytime Greg stayed at the Elegant, he rarely left his room. There was a bar downstairs, but he wasn't a big drinker or socializer. He preferred to just have quiet nights alone in his room watching TV. So that night, Greg cranked the air conditioning to make sure it was as cold as it could get. He liked to sleep in a very cold room. And then he hopped on his bed, and he put 2 big pillows behind his head and he rested up against the headboard. And then he took a towel and he laid it out next to him. And on the towel was his ashtray, his cigarettes, his lighter, his phone, the TV remote, and a candy bar. Then he picked up the TV remote, turned it on, flipped through the channels until he landed on one that was playing Iron Man 2, and he thought, good enough. Put the remote down, picked up his candy bar, opened it up, he ate a piece of his candy, and then he grabbed a cigarette, lit up a cigarette, and he began smoking. The following morning, Susie, Greg's wife, did not get a call from her husband. And he always called her every morning that he was gone. That was their routine, and this was a big break from their routine. And so she tried calling him, and his phone rang and rang and rang and rang. And he never picked up. And so then she called his Beaumont office and he didn't pick up. But after the second or third time she called, his co-workers picked up the phone and they said, hey, Greg's not here, Regs. He hasn't come into work yet. And Susie felt concerned. She felt like something was wrong and she said, do you guys mind just going to his hotel room and knocking on his door and making sure he's okay? And they said, sure, we'll go over there. So the 2 co-workers head over to the hotel, they knock on Greg's door, he doesn't answer, and so they go down and get the manager, who comes up and opens Greg's door, and right away, they find Greg lying dead in the middle of his hotel room. The way Greg was positioned when they found him, It looked like he had fallen to his knees and then fallen again onto his face. And his left arm got kind of tucked underneath his body. And still in his two left fingers was a cigarette that had not fallen from his hand that had burned down to the wick. The room was exceptionally warm, and Greg's skin was grayish-blue. Immediately after seeing Greg, the two co-workers called 911. Shortly after the ambulance arrived at the hotel, Detective Scott Apple arrived in his cruiser. Apple was a short guy, very, 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 very fit. He had silver hair that he spiked up. He looked 100% cop, and he worked basically 24/7. When he got up to room 348, there was no sign of a break-in. Nothing had been disturbed inside of the room, and there was no blood or obvious wound on Greg, with the exception of a slight abrasion on his cheek from when he came down and hit his face on the rug. He looked around the room and he found Greg's wallet that was sitting in the back pocket of his jeans. There was hundreds of dollars in his wallet that had not been taken, so he ruled out robbery. He went out into the hall and he began interviewing the other occupants of the surrounding rooms, and no one had heard anything and no one had seen anything. He went back into the hotel room and he began looking around for drugs of any kind or any substance that Greg might have taken that could have contributed to his death. And there was nothing, no prescription pills, no alcohol, nothing. Later that day, after the family had been notified of Greg's passing, his grief-stricken wife, Susie, called Detective Apple and she said, "You know, my husband did not take good care of himself. He had a terrible diet. He's been smoking like a chimney since he was a young teenager, and he never saw a doctor. And I always told him that if he wasn't careful, something like this was going to happen. I always worried that he might have a heart attack or something." So at this point, not only does Greg's family think he died of natural causes, Detective Apple also thinks the same thing. He's thinking about what he saw in the hotel room, and there's no sign of any foul play. It just looks like a guy whose lifestyle caught up to him. Greg's body was sent to Dr. Tommy Brown, who in Beaumont, Texas, he was like the medical examiner. He'd been doing this for years and years. Dr. Brown had read ahead that they believed Greg had died of a heart attack or something like that, and when his body was wheeled in front of him, there was nothing he saw right away that contradicted the theory. The only two marks that the doctor noted on the outside of Greg's body was the small abrasion on his face from where he landed on the rug, and then he also had another small abrasion on his crotch. But beyond that, the rest of his body was completely unblemished. When he looked inside of his body, it looked like someone had literally just crushed his insides. His torso was full of blood, food from his intestines had been ripped outside, he had ribs broken, internal organs were lacerated, and there was a hole in his heart. Dr. Brown was really confused at what he was looking at, because the severity of Greg's internal injuries were consistent with someone who had been in a severe car crash or who had had a really heavy object land on them. But Greg didn't have any significant external injuries that would support either of those two things happening to him. And he was found in the middle of a hotel room where there was nothing disturbed, and no one had apparently seen or heard anything. And so Dr. Brown says, "Look, I don't have all the answers here, but this was not natural. This is a homicide. And my best guess is he was beaten to death. I know it doesn't really make sense because there's not any external injuries, but he suffered some significant trauma from somebody else, and that's what killed him." When Detective Apple got this report from the medical examiner, he was just as confused as Dr. Brown was, but his attention turned to, okay, well, if he's been murdered, who would want to murder him? And he began digging into Greg's background, and he found that he was universally liked. He was known for being incredibly courteous and polite. He kept to himself. He was in love with his wife and his wife loved him back. There was no evidence of some scandal in the background. He was just this really nice, normal guy, and it didn't make any sense why anybody would want to kill him. After a few months of getting nowhere, and in reality, he hadn't really even gotten started because there wasn't any good starting point. The only thing he could find that was odd about the crime scene was that the convinced room was particularly warm when they walked inside, which was not in keeping with how Greg would have kept the room. But that doesn't explain why his insides were crushed. And so he's got nowhere. And then he makes a discovery. He found in the hotel's maintenance logs on the night Greg died. He had been making popcorn in his microwave and managed to blow a fuse. And it wasn't just his power, maybe Greg didn't know this, but he cut the power to both the room next to him on his right and on his left, and below him. And so he calls down to the front desk, and a maintenance guy came up and he reset the breaker. This opened the door to two theories. The first theory is the maintenance guy, who did have a criminal record. When he came up to fix the breaker, he attacked Gregor. But that was wildly speculative, and there was no evidence to suggest that the maintenance guy would do that, and so that was quickly ruled out. The other theory was Greg's neighbors in room 349 were these two electricians who were big partiers and drinkers. And so Detective Apple suggested that maybe when Greg accidentally cut the power to their room, they were really annoyed. And they went outside in the hall and they saw Greg, and they somehow realized he was to blame for this. And in a drunken rage, they attacked him and killed him. And that's what killed Greg. And even though it was a stretch, it was the closest thing to a motive Detective Apple had found in anyone. And so Detective Apple put on a hidden camera and he went and interviewed these two electricians that were still staying in room 349. And he said when he spoke to them, they were very forthcoming. They seemed very honest. They were appropriately curious about what happened to Greg. And all they said was, look, we had no interaction with him. We did hear him coughing when we came back from the bar. We were at the bar that night. But honestly, that's the extent of our interaction with him. The electricians offered up their cell phone numbers, their email addresses, and said, anything you need from us, we'd be happy to help. We're really sorry this happened. At this point, Detective Apple is back to square one. No one knows what happened to this guy. The one big lead he had, the maintenance records, proved to be a total dead end. And so, unfortunately, this case went cold. 7 months after Greg's death, where there had been absolutely no traction on figuring out what happened to him, Susie, Greg's wife, decided she wanted to hire a private investigator. And her friend suggested she call Ken Brennan, who was a famous private detective who was well known for being able to solve really complex cases. And so on a whim, Susie calls Ken Brennan, not expecting to get through to him, thinking he's probably super busy and has other cases, cause he's on EV and he's this really famous guy. But he picked up the phone and he was like, hey, how can I help you? And Susie couldn't believe it. She had a chance too to tell him about what happened to her husband. And Ken said he was really interested in, that he would take on the case. Ken was a former Long Island cop and he was a D special agent. He spoke with a really thick New York City accent, and he wore t-shirts that were a little bit too small to show off his muscles. And he usually had a big, gaudy gold chain on. Once Ken agreed to take on this case, he flew right to Lafayette, Louisiana, where Susie lived. He sat down and he asked her a lot of really difficult questions about their marriage, about whether she thought he might be cheating on her, if he had like a secret life she didn't know about. And after feeling satisfied that all those avenues had been explored and were not going to lead to the answer, he said, okay, well, can you tell me anything about the crime scene that stood out to you? Is there anything about it that seems off? And Susie said, yeah. Greg always kept the air conditioning on very cold at night. He never slept in a room that wasn't freezing cold. And so I thought it was really odd when his co-workers discovered him that the air conditioning was off and it was really hot inside of the room. That's incredibly unlike Greg for his air conditioning to be off. Ken made a note of this, and then he left Lafayette and he went to Beaumont, Texas to meet up with Detective Apple. And Detective Apple and he actually got along really well. They agreed to work together on this case because Detective Apple feels like he's reached a dead end anyways. Apple brought Ken to the crime scene, he showed him the hotel room, and then afterwards, he turned over all of the documents he had on the case, from the autopsy report to the photographs to anything he'd collected over the 7 months he'd been working on it. That night, Ken diligently looks through all of the documentation, all of the photos. And the next day, when he goes into Apple's office, he says to him, I think I figured it out. And Apple's like, oh really? You figured it out one day after being here? And Ken's like, no, Seriously, I think I figured it out. I have to confirm something with his wife, but I think I have a theory. And so Ken calls Susie right in front of Apple. And when Susie picks up, Ken's like, "Hey, did your husband ever smoke with his left hand? Or did he smoke with his right hand?" And Susie said, "Oh no, he only smoked with his right hand." And Ken goes, "Thank you very much." He hangs up and he goes, "Apple, I got it." And so Apple's like, "Okay, what's your theory?" And Ken says, "Okay, so I spoke to Susie, and she told me it was very strange that his room was not air conditioned when they discovered his body, because Greg was known for always turning on the air conditioning to as cold as it can get, especially at night when he went to bed. And so when his power went out the night before, his air conditioning would have gone out. So the maintenance guy comes up, turns the power back on, but it doesn't trigger the air conditioning to turn back on. The room is still cold from having been air conditioned all evening to that point. And so the TV is back on. And so perhaps Greg turns and just starts watching TV because the room feels air conditioned. He hasn't realized that he hasn't turned the air conditioning back on again. Now, this is Beaumont in the summer, so it's going to get really hot in his room really quickly. And as soon as it starts to warm up in there, he's going to realize, "Oh, I didn't turn the AC back on." And he would go over and turn it on again. And so, because the air conditioning wasn't on, and we know that the power was restored at 8:30, then he must have died after the power was on, but before it got warm enough in the room for him to recognize he did not turn the AC on, which means he would have died somewhere between 8:30 and 9:0 p.m. that night. And so Apple's like, "Wow, that's pretty impressive. Except that doesn't really help us figure out how he died or who killed him." And Ken puts his hand up and he says, "I know, I'm just building the whole picture here. Okay, so we have him dying between 8:30 and 9:00, and I don't think he was beaten to death. I think a lot of people want that to be what killed him because it's kind of the only thing that might make sense. But I say it definitely doesn't make sense because of the cigarette. Now, we found that cigarette in his left hand, and I talked to his wife and she said he only smokes in his right hand. And so what I think happened is the power came back on at about 8:30, which is what the report says. TV turns back on, Greg doesn't turn the air conditioning back on. He sits on his bed, he's watching TV. He lights up a cigarette and he's smoking with his right hand. And then something happens to him, which I'll get into my theories on that. And he jumps off the bed and he starts making his way to the door to get help. And he transfers the cigarette from his right hand to his left hand so he can use his right hand to turn the doorknob and open the door to safety. But he doesn't make it. He falls to his knees and he falls to the ground, and his cigarette's still in his fingers and he dies. And Apple's like, "You know what? That's pretty good. It makes a lot of sense. But the crucial missing piece here is, well, what was the trauma he suffered that caused him to jump from his bed and run to the door and then ultimately die?" Ken's like, "I got a theory on that too, but I gotta be in the hotel room to see if it's true." So Apple and Ken go back to the hotel room. When they get there, Ken goes inside and he starts walking around looking at the ceiling, the wall, the ground, and then finally he stops when he's looking back towards the front door leading back into the hall. And he points at the wall and he says there, and Apple looks at what he's pointing at, and it looks like there had been some patchwork on the wall in the same spot where the doorknob, when its wings open, would hit the wall. And so Apple's looking at it and he's like, "That's just from the doorknob." And so Ken takes the door and he opens it all the way to where the doorknob is pressed against the wall, and it's to the right of this patchwork, meaning this patchwork is not connected to the doorknob. Apple was confused and was about to ask questions, and Ken was like on a roll and he said, "Hold on." And he goes outside. He goes next door to room 349. They go inside, and Apple walks in the room and he's watching Ken do his work. And Ken's rubbing his hands all over the wall. And eventually he stops and he looks up at Apple. And he takes his finger and he pushes on one spot in the wall as Apple is watching. And his finger goes right in, and what he pushed on was this little chunk of toothpaste that had been wedged in this little tiny hole in the wall. and he pushed it through. Apple brought in a crime scene investigations unit who carefully excavated both sides of this wall, and they shined a laser from 349 into Greg's room, and the trajectory of the laser going through this hole lined up perfectly with where Greg would have been sitting on the bed, smoking cigarettes, eating candy, watching a movie. So Ken and Apple go back to the medical examiner, Dr. Brown, and they say, "Look, you missed something because Greg got shot." And unfortunately, Greg's body had already been cremated, but they did have the pictures to look at from the autopsy. And sure enough, they find that little tiny laceration in his crotch was actually an entrance wound. And then when Dr. Brown pointed out there was a hole in the heart and it kind of lined up with the trajectory that bullet would have been traveling through his body, Dr. Brown realized he had made a mistake and he changed the autopsy report to reflect a gunshot wound. Ken and Detective Apple Ray interviewed one of the electricians that had been in room 349. That was in the room where the gunshot had originated from. His name was Lance. And when they brought him in, they said this is totally routine. You know, it's been 7+ months since Greg's death, and what we're doing is any of our witnesses, we want them to sign a statement basically attesting that this is what I saw or didn't see. And so they had prepared a statement that basically lined up with the first thing he had told police, which was, "I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything." And they said, "Is there anything you want to change about your story, or is this exactly what you saw unheard?" And Lance said, "Yeah, that's exactly. I don't know anything. I wish I knew more. I'm sorry." And all right, well then, can you sign this document saying that you don't know anything and you didn't see anything? And he said, "Yeah." He signs the document and then Ken's like, "All right, gotcha. Because we know a gunshot was fired from your room and that's what killed Greg. And so you need to tell me who shot the gun, otherwise I'm taking you to jail for submitting a false police report." At this point, Lance crumbles and the truth comes out. And he said that he and the other electrician in the room with him, whose name was Muller, they were goofing around and drinking that night. And Muller went out and got his pistol from his car, and he brought it in, he was goofing around with it. And Lance was saying that he was trying to get him to stop doing that, but he kept goofing around with the gun. And at one point, he aimed the gun at Lance and Lance kind of batted it away from him. He dropped the gun, it landed, and it went off. And they saw where the bullet hole was, saw it was into Greg's room, and they both froze. And they listened to see if anybody had reacted to this gunshot, and he said they didn't hear anything for a long time, and that made them believe that no one was in the other room, that no one was in Greg's room, and that they were in the clear. And so they left and went to the bar. They didn't even think to check on whoever was in that room. And when they came back, they said they heard Greg coughing in his room, and that further confirmed that he must not have been in there when they fired the shot, and he's totally fine and they are totally in the clear. The next day, Lance said when they saw his body being taken out, at first they did think, "Oh my goodness, this is us. We did this." But they overheard Detective Apple walking around, interviewing people, saying out loud that, "Yeah, we think this is natural causes. Yep, looks like a heart attack. This is probably nothing. I'm sure it's nothing." And they were like, "Oh phew. It's not us." And so they actually believed it was just a coincidence that on the same day, they're firing a rogue bullet into Greg's room. That Greg had a heart attack and died separately. But Lance would say that somewhere in the back of both of their minds, they knew they probably had something to do with it. And so they covered their tracks and they put toothpaste in the wall to cover up the hole. And they hid the gun. And they intentionally kept information from the police. And so ultimately, Muller, the owner of the gun, the one who really instigated that night, waving the gun around and the one who actually dropped the gun, he was charged with manslaughter and was given 10 years in prison. So that's gonna do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you found the secret in today's video, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. Give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, The next time the like button approaches you and asks for a good place to lay out and get a good suntan, suggest they use the faraway dock on Kidney Mountain. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just John Ballin for 116. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok, where my username is MrBallen's. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen's. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's gonna do it. See ya. This story has a wild ending. It is worth sticking around for. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do. And we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and chain them to the bed while they're sleeping. And then put on the far side of the room a very loud speaker and set it to play the song Boots, Boots, Boots. Boots by Rudyard Kipling on repeat for at least 48 hours. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's story. Simply put, a goth is someone who finds beauty in things that most other people consider to be pretty dark. But most Americans tend to associate the term goth with the teenagers of the late 90s and early 2000s that wore all black and wore heavy black boots and would hang out in cemeteries. And while that representation of goth culture is, of course, limited, it is a good representation of the two protagonists in today's story, best friends Rachel and Molly. In the 1990s, Rachel and Molly were full-blown goths. They had black hair, black makeup, black clothes. They had the black, heavy combat boots. And at one point, they and their other goth friends started hanging out in a cemetery to be kind of ironic and funny. Like, look at us, we're goth. We hang out in cemeteries. And then they actually enjoyed it and began hanging out in the cemetery like every weekend. One Friday night, Molly calls Rachel to go hang out in the cemetery. And as it happened, Rachel was just sitting at home and she was bored out of her mind. And so the call came at a perfect time. And so Rachel's like, yeah, I'd love to go. So she flies downstairs and she sits on her front step and she's waiting for Molly to show up. And eventually, Molly's car rolls down the street and Rachel immediately recognizes that Molly is the only one in the car. And Rachel, whenever she would go to the cemetery at night with Molly, they were always there with a group of at least 4 people. Even though they liked hanging out in the cemetery, they did recognize that it's a little bit creepy at night to be out there. And so, they liked kind of rolling in a fairly big group. And so Rachel hops in the car and her first question to Molly is, where is everybody? Are they meeting us there? Oh. And Molly said, oh no. Everybody else is either working or they're kind of hungover from the party from last night, so it's just us 2. I hope that's okay. And at the time, Rachel actually in her head was like, no, I don't really want to do this anymore, but she was like, oh yeah, that's fine. Yeah, we'll just go. Just the 2 of us. It'll be fine. Molly takes off from Rachel's house and she makes the familiar, kind of winding commute to the front gate of this enormous cemetery that sits right in the center of town. They drive underneath this massive wrought iron gate that looks very medieval, very foreboding. It looks like it's out of a cheesy horror movie. This, like, cliche entrance to a cemetery. And so they go through there and there on this road that stretches all the way down through the cemetery and basically splits it into. On the left side as you're driving in was an area closest to town, and also it butted up against a major public university. And then on this side of the cemetery, you had a bunch of residential houses that butted up against the side of the cemetery. And where Molly and Rachel and their crew liked to go was on the right side, all the way back in the corner. because there was a section that was kind of situated between these two hills where not only were they obscured from the cemetery road and the main road once they were down in this little depression, there was also no houses that happened to look over that spot. So it was kind of like the hidden section of the cemetery. And there was also this big boulder that people sat on the big tree you could lean up against. So that was their spot. So Molly drives in the gates, she heads down that road, and she turns right onto a dead-end road. She takes that down about a couple 100 meters till it dead ends, and they park. And then the girls get out of the car, they light up cigarettes, and they walk down this hill that's just beyond where this dead end comes to an end. And so they walk down this hill and it brings them to this clearing where this big rockin' tree is. Rachel hops up on the rock and she turns around, so she's facing back up the hill they just walked down. And Molly is right next to her on her right, leaning up against the tree. And for the next hour or so, they just crushed cigarettes and talked about their various boyfriend drama and life drama and whatever else they wanted to talk about. After a while, the girls started to smell a bonfire. And from where they were sitting, they could see a hill in front of them. There was actually another hill over here. And so their view was pretty obscured out of this little valley they're in. So they can't see any fires anywhere. So they assumed that what they're smelling was a fire coming from the other side of the cemetery, because there's that huge university over there, and they knew sometimes the college kids would come onto the cemetery and they would light fires over there. And inevitably, the police would get called and they would break up the fire, cause you're not allowed to have a fire on the cemetery. And whenever they did that, the police would actually make rounds around the entire cemetery, and historically, basically, if you were there hanging out, they would tell you to leave. And so they think, okay, this is probably a good time to leave, because probably in the next 30 minutes to an hour, the police are gonna be here. They're gonna come over here, see our car, and they're gonna ask what we're doing and we're gonna have to leave. So let's just leave now. So Rachel hops off the rock and the two of them begin meandering their way back up the hill towards the car. When they get about halfway up the hill, they notice to their right something bright. Now, because they were higher up, they could actually see over the hill to their right, and what they were seeing was the top of a bonfire. So the girls take a couple more steps up the hill to gain some elevation to hopefully be able to see better down into where this fire is. But even when they're up almost at the top of the hill, that fire is too far down on the other side of that hill that they can't see any people, and they can't really tell how big the fire is. They're just basically seeing the top flickers of it. Even though they don't know anything about the people over there at this fire, what they do know is when they showed up, there was no fire over there. They would have recognized it. So whoever's over there had to have shown up and built this fire while Rachel and Molly were down at the rockin' tree, which means there's a pretty good chance they didn't see Rachel and Molly. This is a pretty private area. Their car was parked a little bit off to the side of the trail. And so Molly picks up on this and she says to Rachel, "Hey, let's sneak back down and walk up their hill and look down and see who's here's. I bet it's a bunch of college kids. It'll be funny to see what they're doing." But Rachel had a weird feeling about it. She's thinking to herself, if this is college kids, why would they have their bonfire this far away from campus? I mean, this is literally the farthest point away from the side of the cemetery that's close to their campus. If they're having a party over here, there's a good chance that anybody going to it is going to need to drive. And that just doesn't make sense if you can just walk to the other side of the campus and have a bonfire over there. And so Rachel is logically deciding that this is probably not college kids. But who else is having a bonfire in the secret section of the cemetery in the middle of the night? And Rachel's thinking that now if the police come here, they're definitely going to see us because we're so close to this bonfire. And so it's probably not a good idea to stick around much longer. But despite Rachel's hesitations, she is intrigued and she does want to see what's going on over there. So the two girls walk down the hill. They make it down to the rock on the tree. Then they turn left and they begin walking up this other hill, the hill that's going to bring them up to the fire. And so they only get a few steps up this hill when they are suddenly hit with this disgusting, putrid smell that just encompasses them and it makes them gag. And they're covering their mouth and their nose, And Rachel exclaims, "Oh my God, what is that?" And then as soon as she says it, she realizes she was really loud, and she's like, "Shit." And Molly's like, "Shit." And they both freeze, wondering if the people on the other side of the hill have heard them. And after a little bit of silence, Molly's like, "You want to keep going?" And Rachel's like, "No, we gotta go." Between the horrible smell that's obviously coming from this weird fire and the fact that Rachel basically just gave them away, and so for all we know, these people on the other side of this hill have heard us and now they're waiting for us to come over the edge. And it's gonna be really awkward if we suddenly crash their bonfire. Rachel, she's thinking about these things, and so she's like, "Let's go out. We gotta go." Molly's disappointed, but she gets it, and the two girls turn around and begin walking back. And so they walk past the tree and the rock on their left, they turn right, and they're about to walk up the hill that's going to bring them to their car when Rachel just turns around to look at the hill towards the fire where they were headed before. And standing at the top of that hill was a man, just looking down at them. And the fire is illuminating him from behind, and they can clearly tell it's a man standing there looking at them. And immediately, the girls felt really uncomfortable. It was almost like they had just been caught spying, even though they didn't actually get caught spying. It was what they were going to go do, and so they felt like they had almost been caught red-handed. And so Molly and Rachel just turn and begin walking up the hill kind of with their heads down. They just felt kind of awkward. And so they move a few more steps up this hill and Rachel looks again at where this guy was standing. And he's now gone. And Rachel's relieved, but then she realizes he's gone because he's power walking down the hill towards them. And Rachel gasps and she grabs Molly and pushes her and says, "Go, go, go, go. Go, go, go." And they start running up the hill. And Rachel looks around and now this guy is running towards them. He's down now at the rock in the tree. He's gaining on them. They sprint up over the top. They run to Molly's car, and Molly's fumbling with her keys to get the car open, and Rachel's yelling, "Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up." Finally, she gets it open and they both jump inside. Rachel locks the car doors, and as Molly is turning the key over, Rachel's looking out the back and she's waiting to see this guy. And sure enough, as they pull off, she sees his head come up over the ridgeline just enough that he can clearly see them leaving. And then he ducks back down and he disappears. And the two of them speed down the road. They make a left onto that main drive and they speed out of the cemetery. For the first few minutes of their drive, neither of them say anything. This was just a very traumatic experience, and it was also very confusing because they thought they were going over to spy on college kids having a bonfire and then they're hit with that horrible smell. Like, what was that horrible smell? And then they leave, and there's this guy who did not look like he was a college kid. He looked like he was probably in his 40s, and then he's chasing them. You know, like what was that? And when they did start talking about it, they couldn't really come to any sort of rational conclusion of what had just happened. And so they were both very spooked and they decide, let's just go home and talk about this tomorrow. And so Molly drops Rachel off at her house and Molly goes home and both girls go to bed. The next morning, Rachel gets up and she heads down to the kitchen where her mom is already there having her morning coffee. And Rachel sits down and she's not a big talker. She's not about to start by saying, "Hey, guess what happened to me last night at the cemetery?" Instead, she just sits there and for a little bit, her mom just kind of rambles about work and what she's doing that day. And then all of a sudden her mom, it's like she has this epiphany and she goes, Rachel, did you hear what happened last night?" And Rachel's like, "No, what?" And her mom's like, "Someone I work with, I don't know her personally, but she works in the same building as me. She got kidnapped from the parking garage where I park my car. I have seen her park her car in this lot, and she got kidnapped." And Rachel's like, "Oh my God, really? Like, what happened to her? Did they find her?" And her mom was like, "Yeah, but it was too late. The person who had kidnapped her had killed her, and then tried to dispose of her body at the cemetery by burning her in a bonfire. Rachel suddenly felt sick, because now she knew what was happening last night and she knows what that smell was. Rachel immediately pours her heart out about everything that happened the night before. And her mom is totally horrified, but she's in particular horrified that they clearly had been there when the killer had arrived and set up shop and began burning this body. They were just literally 50 meters away the whole time. And so her mom tells her, "You and Molly have to go to the police station and make a statement. They have not caught this person yet. You've seen this person, you gotta tell them." And so Rachel calls Molly and breaks the news about what was actually happening the night before and who was actually chasing them to their car, and says, "We have to go to the police station." And so they agree. They go down to the police station and they tell them what happened. But they didn't get a great look at him. They could only say that he was maybe in his 42nds and maybe average height. And so the police wrote it all down, but they basically said, "Look, if you can think of more details, we would love to hear those, because this isn't really enough to go on." And so the girls go back home and they're thinking to themselves, did he see us? Does he know that we saw him? Do you think he knows that we know he's a killer now? And so they're freaking out. But luckily, within 48 hours, the police actually caught this guy because he was driving around in the murder victim's car and someone spotted him. They pulled him over and he confessed, and so he went to jail. Needless to say, Rachel and Molly thanked their lucky stars that when they started ascending that hill and they were hit with that smell, that Rachel said, "Let's not go any farther, let's leave," because had they continued and gone to the other side, they could have wound up in the bonfire too. So that's gonna do it. Guys, I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and tell us where you found it in the episode. Give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the like button's house and chain them to the bed while they're sleeping. And then put a speaker on the other side of the room and have it play the song Boots, Boots, Boots. Boots by Rudyard Kipling on repeat for 24 to 48 hours. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our 3, 4, even 5 weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same, it's just JohnBallen for 116. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok, where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So, whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's gonna do it. See ya.